Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's show. Before I introduce this evening's guest, as usual, I'll let you know what's coming up next week. Next week, we've got someone coming on to defend John Swinney's disgusting RSHP.Scot sex education resources. So that's surely going to be interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've tried to get someone to come and defend these for months. So we've actually got someone who's going to come on and try and argue the case for them. So that's going to be very interesting next week, to say the least. What are we up to in the family party at the moment? Our big focus at the moment is we're going through a process to select some new national leaders. We're going to strengthen our national leadership team. So over the next few weeks, there'll be some announcements of some new people taking up new positions within the party. So that's going to be a good step forward for us. Watch this space. Now, just before I introduce this evening's guest, I need to share you a tweet from the Scottish government. I saw this just before we went on air. This is just fantastic. This is what your taxes are spent on. The Scottish government tweeted this: "Dark evenings can feel bleak, but lighting candles is a good way to relax and look after your well-being." Thought we were on the government to be doing, giving little tips. Anyway, so we replied to them as the Scottish Family Party. "Thank you, government. We don't know what we'd do without you. What music do you recommend we listen to?" But that really is it's the chief mammy mindset, isn't it? That the government's looking after us all. That they're assuming like people they can't really look after themselves. They maybe they're a bit thick. They don't really know what to do with themselves on a cold, dark evening. But these pearls of wisdom from some expert or other is going to keep people on the right track and look after their well-being. Anyway, right, on to this evening's guest. We have with us, for the first time, I'm sure it won't be the last time, Alex Thompson. Alex contributes to the UK column, YouTube channel and alternative media outlet. He's based in the Netherlands, currently working as a translator. But let's say hello to Alex. Welcome, Alex.
Good evening, Richard. A great pleasure to be with you.
How's the weather over there in, is it The Hague? No, Rotterdam.
Near Rotterdam, just south of Rotterdam. Quite dreich today, actually. Quite misty. The clothes didn't dry outside. It was a bit of a disaster in that regard. But we're getting there. We tend to have about the same weather as the east coast of Scotland.
Right. So you've had a bit of snow.
We have.
Right. Good. Excellent. Now, we've got some juicy topics for this evening. I'm sure you'll agree. We're going to talk about Twitter, a bit more broadly, social media censorship. That's an extremely important issue at the moment. So I'm going to have a little talk about Donald Trump in general, his legacy, etc. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about satanic ritual abuse, which you might have been aware that's been something, there's been attention on that rumbling away in the background. A few people have raised it as something they're interested in. So we're going to have a look at that, some of the evidence for it, and see what our take is about that. But starting with the social media business, I mean, things have gone up. I don't know how many gears they've stepped up in the last few days. It seems like the people going into the Capitol building in Washington has been the green light for the big tech companies, and they're just thinking, right, this is our big opportunity to do what we would have loved to have done years ago and shut out Trump. That's part of the story, but also to be hitting countless sort of conservative commentators, media outlets all over the English-speaking world in a totally unprecedented manner. And not only that, Parler, the alternative to Twitter, has basically been shut down by the other companies because they've restricted it from their app store, from their server capacity, etc. So this really is an unprecedented clampdown on free expression by these companies. So, Alex, you'll have been following this, obviously. What's your take?
Well, what we're seeing in a legal sense, I think, is, and this is US specific, but it has worldwide ramifications. We're seeing the hubris of the social media companies coming back to bite them very shortly. Because for those who aren't aware of the legal framework on which the whole of the world enjoys this social media freedom, whether you're President Trump or the humblest of people in a third world country, the basis of it is that the 1995 Telecommunications Act, US federal legislation, of course, enabled a Section 230 exemption from many obligations for the social media giants in their very early iteration. We didn't use the phrase back then, but the concept was already clear in the mind's eye to the web designers that such a thing would come about. And the nascent big players sent their lobbyists to Washington at that point and said, look, we are actually, we're not publishers, we're platforms. So a lot of the regulation, taxation, and censorship that you would normally, of course, the word censorship is not used in an English-speaking country, but that's the de facto what it is. A lot of that you would ordinarily insist upon with press publications online is not applicable to us. We are a new breed. We are democratically enabling the masses to have their say. We're platforms. We will not touch content. And now Apple, in its current spat with Parler, and the same applies very much to Amazon in its spat with Parler, have said, oh, no. We insist that you must edit. They haven't used that term either, but be a publisher in the legal terms. This content, we can't just have any plebs talking about what they think. At the same time, our mainstream platforms will continue to benefit from the Section 230 freedom. So, of course, this is something which ferociously gets attacked from the Democratic Party side in the US as an attack on the First Amendment whenever questions are raised about repealing the Section 230 entitlements or benefits which these companies have. And people might be thinking, why is Alex going into legal detail? Well, although I'm not a lawyer and certainly not versed in US federal law to that extent and the special field of telecommunications, that's where you have to begin. You have to look at the framework that's been created quite cynically to allow for a situation. And the social media is part of Web 2.0 and Web 3.0. It's an iteration which was not really meant to go as free as it has. I think the wrong kinds of voices have been heard, or shall we use the trendy 2010s terminology, the wrong voices have been amplified.
Yeah. What I used to say about the big tech companies, I used to say they're basically wanting to make money. That's what they're in it for. But they're big companies making a huge amount of money, so they're scared they're going to get sort of anti-capitalist protesters, and they'll upset the left because they're big American companies, and they'll come and smash the windows of their offices, and they'll become unpopular. So what you do about that, then you do every social justice cause going, and then you keep on the right side of the people who might otherwise come and smash your windows. Now, I used to think that sort of explained it, the wokeness or the sort of left bias of these corporations. But seeing what's happening now, it's making me think, no, there's more to it than this. These people are actually determined to exercise huge control over the content for political ends.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. If people, perhaps most of your viewers have vaguely heard of them, but some will not have. The Veritas Project, big on social media, actually, who have sent a number of people into the tech companies for months, and in fact to political offices as well, but their biggest exposés have been the tech companies in Silicon Valley. And from candid camera footage, which is very good video and audio quality these days, and subtitled as well, they have caught a number of high-ups in the policy, the censorship parts of all the social media companies, swearing blind about any kind of socially conservative Christian, Jewish, Muslim attitudes on the web or in the higher offices of the United States, and saying it's our job to shut those people up. This is not a surprise now. The likes of Mr. Zuckerberg himself and his equivalents at the helm of the other social media giants may be apolitical or vaguely coastal liberal, in a sense, liberal democratic ideals. Possibly they have a bit more of a commitment to shutting out social conservatism from the dialogue, but it's the ranks below them that really matter. They're very subject to entryism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But what's the response been to this in Europe? You keep your finger on the pulse, don't you? What's been the feedback?
Well, of course, being in Scotland, you're aware of the mixed legal jurisdiction and in some senses now the mixed political culture. It's becoming a sense of a half Anglo-Saxon, half continental jurisdiction in many ways. So as people would expect if they can compare Scotland and England, the European attitude is more like the Scottish political elite, but enhanced because it's got no Anglo-Saxon common law tradition. Everything is skewed towards the right to privacy, which is something that the common law has long resisted. And the dialogue is also skewed towards sovereignty increasingly. The EU wants cultural sovereignty, defense sovereignty. And this dialogue ultimately means that they want to follow the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China in having all the servers and all the companies based domestically, even if they bear a foreign brand. It'll be something like a foreign minority stake in a joint stock holding company. So it will be entirely regulated by domestic law. For the EU, that would be the law of the European Union. So we're now seeing the likes of Chancellor Merkel, although she knows that Trump hates her guts and vice versa, saying it was entirely premature and a bad omen for Twitter in particular to have thrown Mr. Trump off. And President Obrador used the same language, an ill omen. That Facebook, as I was mentioning on UK Column News today, had set this list of rules. So we are getting heads of state and heads of government in the European continent and beyond saying, who on earth do these Silicon Valley giants think they are? But usually that's because on the continent, of course, they want political control. In the Anglo-Saxon world, we have this fiction that we want the free market or freedom of opinion to reign supreme. Of course, it doesn't.
Yeah. So their complaint isn't that these conservative voices are being turned down, if you like. Their complaint is that they want to have the authority to do it rather than the social media companies. Yeah,
this is it, because Europe is always about the regulation of society. It might be a very enlightened version, such as the Dutch have had historically, but ultimately that's what we stand in the United Kingdom and particularly in Scotland to lose with the current the direction that politics and law is taking. The ultimate presumption that you're free to be who you want to be or who you feel called to be and speak your mind. That has never been absolute in Europe.
No, but I think this is one of the issues where the Conservatives fail us completely, because Boris Johnson should be sitting there thinking, right, this is not good. I mean, these are going to be undermining basically voices that are going to be supporting our party to some extent. I know the Conservative Party is not conservative, but roughly speaking, you should be a little bit worried that the social media giants are pushing in that direction. And the UK Conservatives should be thinking, right, we're not going to have this here. We need to do something about this, that this is going to be disadvantageous for us. I mean, it would seem obvious that they need to be saying that, but
this is something you've been wondering about for some time, I think, Richard. What are the Conservative Party, north or south of the border? It started, I think, with Peter Hitchens noticing that the Conservative Party was conserving nothing. Well, obviously, he wasn't the first, but he was the first noticeable commentator to be saying this. And since him, there have been a number of other people, I think, unaware of each other, spontaneously rediscovering this attitude that the Conservative Party actually is probably, if you want to identify one party that's the source of the nation's ills, it is, for all the looniness in Labour, it is probably the Conservatives, because they're holding the work, as it were, blocking the way to any kind of social conservative party being mainstream. Again, think of the European situation after the war, and particularly with the Roman Catholic parts of Europe, but not exclusively so. They had these Christian Democrat parties. These parties devolved as the churches emptied out, and people didn't call themselves Christians anymore, emptied out into just being a voice for big business and doing things the way we've always done them, whether that was properly conservative or not. And the big shock was that parties arose, in simple parlance, to the right of those parties. And that was not supposed to be part of the deal. The Christian Democrats across Europe and the Conservatives in the United Kingdom were meant to be as conservative as it got. But we've got to the stage now where we've got people joining who got to ministerial rank who were something very much different in their earlier career. Liz Truss, for example, used to be Liberal Democrat. And I'm not saying that a single case is to be focused on, but it is indicative of the driven Marxism that comes in now. And the David Cameron's government arguably was quite a long way to the left of Tony Blair's on some issues, such certainly law and order.
Yeah, but do you think the Conservatives think to themselves, right, we might be a bit vulnerable on the right, basically, from Brexit Party, whatever. They might think so. If social media can just cut out that section of the political spectrum, if they can suppress it, then we can just concentrate on fighting on one front. We can go to the centre. I mean, do you think any of them actually think that, or
well,
that being too cynical?
CCHQ, Conservative Central Headquarters, is notoriously, for anyone in the Westminster bubble or even the Whitehall bubble, it's notoriously the most Machiavellian of the major party headquarters. I think it would give even the SNP a run for its money. And the reason for that is precisely that their job is to prevent anyone doing an end run against the supposed bastion of conservatism. And again, in a purer or more stitched up system, the United States, where there really is no hope for non-tycoons or third parties to get into the running, there have been a number of people very comparable to the Scottish Family Party support base who've gone to, as you'd expect them to do, as in Britain, they would go to the Conservatives first, often as you did. And in the United States, they often go to their local Republican Party. Some of them have got into, state level or even beyond that, caucuses of the Republican Party and said, what's happening to families is atrocious. Look at our tax bill. Are there any breaks that you can offer families? And in those situations, they have been frankly told, listen, the Conservatives have got nowhere else to go. We've got them in the bag. We should be tickling those who are enticed to vote for a more left-wing party. Now, obviously, Britain does things with a lot more panache, a lot more suaveness than that. But that gives me my primary indication. And by the way, the Dutch political scene is very similar with its frankness. So if I triangulate between those, I'm pretty sure that in a very elegant, devious way, the British Conservative Party has spent most of its time working out how to prevent the likes of you and me from getting a followership, whether inside or outside the party.
Yeah. I think this anti-democratic feeling that we've been aware of for a long time, I think this is coming out through the social media censorship. What the social media companies are thinking, if we just let people say what they think, this is going to be terrible.
Yeah,
I think I was imagining in Germany. I mean, the argument for Germans is basically, we tried democracy and we ended up with Hitler. So, democracy on its own, you really want to be careful with that. We need real restrictions.
Oh, it's not just Germany, Richard. This is standard in continental universities. They make much less bones about it than Britain would. They tell their undergrads, particularly in, shall we say, the politically important courses like law schools and so on, economics, they tell them from the start, listen, we Europeans tried democracy and the plebs were the wrong kind of plebs. So now our big slogan is the rule of law, which is something they got from the English-speaking world and don't understand the meaning of. In fact, we're going into detail on this, David Scott and I and and Mike Robinson, in a podcast series, which people can follow by going to ukcolumn.org/constitution. We're calling it A Dissident's Guide to the Constitution. And in fact, we've been doing democracy in the last and also in a forthcoming episode. And after that, we're going to tackle the rule of law. Because as you quite rightly say now, the English-speaking world and the continent have got to this stage where there is this quite disingenuous claim by the think tank brigade that the people are less than optimal. We have to, elect a new people, as some of the Central European leaders cynically put it. That's the accusation they cast at them. And how are they going to do that? There's increasing noises about, well, you see, democracy isn't absolute. There's also our democratic institutions. There's also the rule of law. There's international standards. These are the slogans by which, even quite people that you would expect to follow their duty very well, like very senior US military officers in the transition, are inventing reasons to follow, what they call their hearts or their conscience or the principle of the rule of law instead of a democratically elected executive.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of some Islamic states where they're democratic, they elect a government, but above that is the religious authority, and he sets the boundary on what the government can do. And I think that this attitude that's emerged is similar to that, isn't it? They want democracy. They want people to be able to choose within a certain spectrum.
You don't have to go to Iran to look for a Council of Guardians, Richard. I'm sitting in a country that has one, except that nobody knows about it because it sits between the two houses of parliament, and it calls itself the Council of State. And its job is, if a bill introduced particularly in the Dutch House of Commons is too democratic, for example, if the wrong kind of plebs get enough of a vote to decide that they want to give single earner families a tax break, or they want to tackle petty crime in ways that are unacceptable. The job of this Council of State, of unelected legal experts, is to sit between the Houses of Parliament and bat it back before it ever gets up to the Dutch upper chamber and say, oh, no, that this breaches constitutional principles and the rule of law, But because it has a fancy French name, and most European countries have got one of these, nobody bats an eyelid. And of course, this is coming in now in the UK at UK level, but also in the devolved assemblies with judicial review taking on a similar role. Actually, I think that SFP policies will find that increasingly in future. That's even if you manage to get something through Hollywood by a miracle and great lobbying of other parties, you will find judicial review taking the sharp edges off what you've wanted to enact.
Well, that's interesting. So what's your forecast on the social media front? There's been this pushback from some European leaders. Are they going to lose a lot of, I know they're not customers, a lot of users to alternative platforms? Are they going is it going to damage their reputation, or is it going to carry on the way it's going? What do you think?
The more tech savvy people that I follow, who straddle the divide between being political dissidents and commentators on an economic issue that they earn their money with, for example, being computer guys, their attitude is we're going to get more of a spectrum, actually, a more sophisticated solution. People are going to continue to visit YouTube for a great user experience because it's well programmed. Obviously, it's got a huge head start there. They're going to continue to watch their movies, their makeup tutorials, their DIY on YouTube. But increasingly, they're going to think.
Will be. Yeah.
Absolutely, there will be a few of those on the alternative sites, but people will keep a bare bones account there who would otherwise be spending maybe 4 hours a day on those sites. They might just be spending 15 minutes a day on them, which is a massive knock to the advertising revenue, obviously. So that they're going to be smart about it. But this is a bit of a link with what we were just discussing. The common people's smartness is often underrated by the grand planners of society who view society as a system and don't really understand human nature. And what they haven't grasped is that people are going to be cute enough to go to YouTube for the things that are politically bland, but for anything spicy or that actually makes a difference to the laws under which they live, people will be going straight to, maybe they're clunkier and they have many fewer viewers, but they'll be going straight to the alternative sites.
Yeah, I think on YouTube, maybe you and I have been dreaming that people sort of stumble across you on YouTube. They're watching the video of cute cats and they happen to see something. They go, but that just doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen. It happened in the 2000 and very early 2010s, but now you're in an eternal feedback loop, aren't you?
Yeah. So I think there's very few new people you reach just by recommendations. I mean, YouTube advertising can work pretty well just to get people aware of, but just through recommendations, it doesn't really happen much. So if it does come to the point where we have to move to other platforms, it will be a blow. But like you say, I think people will adjust with it. But on the other hand, as all channels are trying to reach a broader market, certainly as the Scottish Family Party, we want to reach into the mainstream. So the people who would still be watching YouTube and are just not aware of what's disappeared from it, whatever, we want to be reaching those people. And that's what's going to be a bit harder. In order to communicate with what's probably your core support, that's probably going to remain possible one way or another. But reaching out to new supporters might be difficult. Supporters in different demographics.
Of course, in the days when everyone more or less watched television, there was the opportunity at least to get the name and core principles of your party in people's heads a few weeks before the ballot. Because of the party political broadcast. Now, we still have that as a vestige, but very few people watch the terrestrial broadcasts for their main source of news. And of course, you're very limited in what you can say. And there also used to be much more here on the continent, billboards where all the parties will post their slogans and the main faces of their candidates. So at least there used to be these commons where people were aware that these were all the candidates. And it's almost forgotten now, but half a century ago, the main way people decided how to vote was at hustings. That people would actually go to the village hall and hear the candidates speak. But it's another rotten, controlled scene that actually, because if you look at hustings now, in England, many of them will just have the Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrat party representatives speaking, and we use that phrase deliberately on UK Column News. By the way, we call the candidates for being MP the party representatives because they're talking down to the people, not up to the government anymore. What you'll find is that if it's organised in a church, for example, or a village hall, Mr. Blue, Mr. Red, and Mr. Yellow will be allowed in. And Mr. Independent or Mr. Christian candidate or whatever it may be, or Mr. Single issue campaigner against a war, will be, there's enough footage to show this happening, including to Craig Murray in Blackburn, Lancashire, when he was standing against Jack Straw, unceremoniously chucked out by the verger. You're not on the guest list. Yeah. Well, is that a public or a private event? And of course, in Scotland, you'll find the same with the addition of the SNP.
With the BBC, when I stood in the election last December, the BBC did a hustings in that constituency, and they just said, "You're not invited." Simple as that.
Yeah. So it's very akin to what we were talking about at the top of the hour with social media, isn't it, Richard? You have got groups. Well, this is how we could go very broad with this, but basically, the 20th century state decided in the West that it was too complicated, or that its people were too smart to run everything itself. It would be accused of totalitarianism if it did that. So it would allow, and I'm sorry to say this, that word fascism, which is often bandied about, does come in here because this is a core plank of fascism. It decided that favoured corporations would be given quasi-public status to provide a commons that was not actually public anymore. It's the same with street campaigning for political events, or street preaching or proselytizing for any religion. You will find in most town centres around the United Kingdom and beyond now, you can't preach or speak for a party where you used to. Security guards will come up to you in the shopping centre or even the plaza outside and say, "Off, this is private land now, it's not the council's anymore."
Yeah. The general assumption with the family party is whatever we try to do, there will be some obstacles to it. Hire a venue, stand anywhere, put a table somewhere, just anything. You just assume that there's going to be some sort of resistance.
Well, any speaker with a good pair of lungs on him, like you, Richard, if you wanted to, well, I know after your confrontation with Swinney that you have one, that's enough to get you arrested inside or outdoors for a breach of the peace under the current defamation of Scots law in that regard. In fact, an Aberdeen professor has written a whole book on the misuse of the breach of the peace in Scots law, because it's entirely subjective. It's in the constable's mind. It's even worse than the English legislation.
Yeah. We've covered some of the issues with street preachers. I won't go into them now, but again, that's breach of the peace is normally what the police claim, and they get kicked out of court.
Did you see that the Aberdonian family that got worldwide attention for the brutalization they got a few days ago with the epileptic daughter? The first thing the copper says when he shoulders in is, "Shut up, you, or I'll have you for a breach of the peace." Inside her house, for goodness sake. Yeah. I mean, if you want to, play law with him, I don't know. I'm not qualified to say, but prima facie, it looks like they would have a case for heimsucken under Scots common law, actually, because this is a violent home invasion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Just to tie up, I mean, very, very briefly. So the social media censorship, do you see it just getting worse, or do you see the pushback being successful?
I think we're approaching the limit of what the social media companies can do without a radical change in society now. Any more censorship, and it will be nudging not a third of the population thinking something is deeply wrong here, but a half of the population. Most right-minded people will start thinking these companies are wicked. I don't think they can tolerate that situation. They need the breadth and the depth in society to make their money. So we're probably finding that from this stage onward, it's more of the threat and less of the making good on the threat.
Right. Well, let's hope you're right on that one. Right. That was fascinating. I think we've had given good coverage to that issue. Right. The next thing, moving on, related issue, old Donald Trump and goings on in America. I mean, just Donald Trump throughout his legacy and recent events. What's your take overall? Have you been a fan or?
Never been a fan, been mightily relieved that he's not a man to whom any, and I know some people will laugh at me for saying this, but to whom any accusations of sexual depravity stick. Now, instantly, a lot of the moral conservatives in the SFP or anywhere else will say, "What are you talking about? When he was elected, we heard no end of his way with women." Well, this is where we need a bit of realism, actually. If a man has enough testosterone, shall we say, enough of a healthy attitude to the opposite sex to have had a string of scandals with adult women, that is, in many cases, for the realistic moral conservative, that is a reassurance that he's not spending his time doing unspeakable things with people who are not adults of the opposite sex. There's this often this attitude, an unrealistic attitude, that you should have enough, you should be enough of an alpha male to get to be the leader of the free world, and also you should be such a grass-eating, pious type that you should never have a sexual thought. These two do not go together. And the fact that Trump has had only an interest in women, as it were, is a good sign. It's not children. Yeah, it's not scandalous stuff.
Yeah,
right. So that's the first thing I would say.
That's quite a low bar, isn't
it? It is a low bar, but this is the problem. And in some senses, Mr. Johnson's a lot worse in some ways, but in some senses, the same applies to him. That he's obviously got problems with things that we never had to deal with in Downing Street before, like illegitimate and unacknowledged children, and almost the Elysee Palace level of who's the first lady this week, which was a big problem under Hollande. But we're having a bit of that now. But that said, it is a reassurance that that the guy is not a total pervert, to be frank. And this is a low bar, but it's also a rare joy in the state that the current West is in, to find a leader in that category. Now, what kind of leader has he been? I would basically give him a 3 for his foreign policy and an 8 for his domestic policy, if I was, arrogant enough to try to mark him. But you did ask. So, foreign policy, he was all at sea with, and that's largely because General Flynn was taken out very quickly, and he was the security and defense and foreign policy supreme advisor, as it were, or was destined to be. Trump didn't even pretend to know anything about how foreign countries work. He had an expressed wish not to get embroiled in wars. He didn't know how to stop himself from being pulled into them by the deep state. And Flynn was supposed to be his line of defense, but he was taken out very quickly. And so you did get the Duma incident and a number of other things, and US special forces still unlawfully occupying part of Syria. But on the domestic front, he's been a great builder. He's been the only president since Kennedy, probably, whom the common man has understood, who can be presented by the kind of parents who would vote for the SFP in Scotland to their children as, look, this is a man trying to do his best to lead us. There's no embarrassments here. We don't have to explain to our children why this man is saying these weird things and doing this naughty behavior. We don't have to worry about that. That's been a relief to millions of American families, I think. Mm-hmm. What was his final set piece speech from the border, from Alamo, Texas, quite proudly saying, we have been able to protect people on this side of the border from these really unimaginably terrifying gangs coming across the border, and the COVID that they bring and everything else, simply by the expedient of putting up a wall that was resisted by the state's whole power for decades. That alone, I think, is worth a thumbs up, and it got him a massive vote across the whole length of the border.
Yeah. Let's compare notes. I mean, I would say with Trump, my summary would be policies generally in agreement, character, just generally disastrous. Yes. I remember following the election campaign in 2016. I'd go through phases of thinking, yeah, okay, I would vote for him. Then I'd be thinking, I just could not bring myself to vote for someone. Like the way he was insulting the other candidates in the primaries, all this sort of thing. And there'd be just so many things during the presidency. You just think, however could they end up with that? And I think for the Republican Party, it's sort of come back to bite them, because they took the line that let's go for sort of Mr. Dynamic Charisma. And okay, we know there are like major character flaws here. Well, let's overlook that because we think this person is going to be the best bet. But I think now that's come home to roost.
You can see it from the end game, can't you, Richard? The Republican Party, the grandees, many of them, the Mitch McConnells, would quite obviously want to spend another 8 years in the political wilderness. They would want to lose 2 terms to the Democrats in preference to having a Trump-like candidate in 2024 or 2028. That level of self-sacrifice, which is akin to what's happened with the Conservatives and Labour in the UK at some point in the post-war period. Question of who's going to be the heir to Blair, and it doesn't really matter which of the 2 parties it is. We have to have a centrist, a radical, aggressive centrist. That kind of blows the gaff on the whole game, doesn't it? That actually there is such a thing as a mono-party, a one-party state.
Yeah. I mean, they could have picked, a real right winger, but if he was someone of sounder character, if they'd have had someone with exactly Trump's policies, with his determination, sort of unapologetic stance on a lot of issues, then they could have had that without some of the other glaring character flaws. Because the thing is, the left, the liberal sides, forever trying to say, you lot are bad people. which broadly speaking isn't true. But if you put someone like Trump in, you're inevitably going to give them huge ammunition. So I think for the worldwide conservative movement, I think Trump's been a bit of a disaster. I thought that was going to happen at the beginning. I think particularly with events recently, I think overall it will be, it will be seen as a bit of a disaster. So hopefully the next time round, the Republicans, instead of thinking, oh, well, what we need to do is to get someone who's sort of mushy in the middle, they will have someone who's got conservative values, who's pro-life, for example, as Trump was. There's a really crucial positive about him.
I fear, though, Richard, the pool of those who are independent enough financially and stable enough in character, without being totally ebullient and egotistical, is very limited. Mm-hmm. And many of them get scared off when they announce their candidacy, or even before they get to that stage. There is some hold over so many of them, and this applies to the judiciary as well, the candidates for the Supreme Court. There's a lot of abject terror, actually, when you get above a certain level in US politics. And I saw it back in the civil service days, going to visit counterparts, not just at NSA, but at some of the political departments in downtown as well. That once you got above about GS15, you were very much watching your back for anything you said, actually, more than in most Western capitals. And putting yourself forward as a candidate, is really going to be the end of any family life, because of the aggressive confirmation hearings if you go for an executive position or a judicial position. And if you apply for president, you know what's coming, really. So it's what you're asking for really there is someone with you need to have someone with 6 inches of steel around him, like Trump, in order to weather all that. And that's where the brusqueness comes from, the fact that he told people really what they were. I mean, some Scottish Family Party voters and followers will be aware of John Waters in Ireland, who usually speaks on Gemma O'Doherty's TV channel online now. She's one of the victims of censorship. And because Scotland and Ireland run so parallel in the political developments they're running, I would very much recommend that. And a very recent episode of that is with John Waters reviewing the US election. And the point he makes was that Trump was, he's almost making him into a kind of self-sacrificial hero, which is obviously a kind of mythic level of the story. It's not what Trump was intending to do, maybe. But he says that what Trump's ended up doing is act as the Lone Ranger, saunter into the saloon and show up all the the great and the good there for the scurrilous people they are.
Mm-hmm. So the way I think a lot of people see that Trump has sort of got the unique qualities that were necessary, but I thought the other candidates in the primaries that could have been the presidential candidate in 2016, I thought quite a few of them would have been great.
Similar, like Rubio and that kind of candidates, or
I thought Ted Cruz was good. I haven't been so keen on him recently. I thought Ted Cruz was good. I mean, Carly Fiorina, was it? I thought she was good. But I could see how Trump did it, because he came across as the strong one. Mm-hmm. I think sort of by being a bit rude and whatever. But one way or another, when you watch the debates, he seemed like he was the tough guy.
Yes.
And the others were just a little bit weak alongside it. And I think in these sort of competitions, basically the strong man is going to win.
Yes, it's not the 19th century. You're not reading dense columns of reportage on how the candidates said they would attack this or that issue. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is claimed that a majority of those who listened to the Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960 on the radio thought that Nixon had won, but those that watched television preferred Kennedy because he was younger and handsomer and less sweaty. Is what it came down to it. And there's a flip side to that, of course, that if you want to win by going for your TV image, then by being the biggest beast in the jungle and by being rude to Hillary Clinton, you can get a swing vote. It is an unfortunate fact of postmodern politics. Yeah.
You got any parting shots on Trump, or shall we move on?
Just that I think the movement he's spawned is bigger than himself, and we don't want to get into QAnon in particular. And I'm not going to name names of QAnon enthusiasts. Some people who are quite close to UK column are very keen and convinced by him. I would just say that it's very tragic to watch some of these people, not just Americans either, but some of the European commentators who are absolutely convinced of the Q message, suddenly, feeling more and more let down by the day. There's, the days are ticking away till the 20th, and a few of these channels have been saying more breathlessly each day, Trump is going to hit the button tomorrow, and all the baddies will be locked up. the white hats will take over. There's never any detail to this stuff, and it's again, we come back to the mythical level of politics, which we shouldn't laugh at. People do have dreams bigger than themselves, and when they lose religion, for example, politics is the only big dream that's left. And so in many countries, they talk about the American dream and whatever, the Chinese dream, and it's kind of a secular embodiment of what used to be religion. And so people do have unrealistic expectations of what politics can do for them.
Yeah, I think Trump could have been a cult leader easily if he'd have wanted a different career. I mean, maybe it'll be his career in the future. But if he'd have wanted to lead a cult and take a couple of 100,000 people off in the desert to do, I mean, he could do it. He's now in a position where he could do that. I mean, I've seen people saying, Obama and Clinton, they're all going to get arrested on such and such a date. I just always want to say to people, please just screenshot it, put it in your diary.
Yeah.
Please learn from the experience. I'll certainly learn. I mean, if Obama and Clinton get arrested on the 16th, then I will go back to those posts and I will think, right, what else did you have to say? But I think it's so easy now to go into a world on social media where you can be so insulated from any other type of thought.
That's it.
Once you've been consuming a certain conspiracy theory or whatever for, say, 30 hours on YouTube, if someone comes along like with 5 minutes and tries to just talk you out of it, I mean, it's a waste of time. No point even starting. It's going to take a lot of time to start unpicking this huge structure.
This is reminiscent of a warning sermon I heard some years ago from an American about why you shouldn't give your children unfettered access to television. And the phrase he used was that television is the mediator of hyper-reality. If children saw something on the goggle box back in the 80s and 90s, when that was the highest technology for that kind of thing, they could never be disabused of that notion. It must be true, I saw it on TV, or Santa Claus is real, I saw him on TV. And that is more immediate to them than what their parents and teachers have to say, because they're just boring people in what we now call meat space, or what some of the very cynical call meat space. And that's just been squared or cubed with first the internet and then social media. Those voices inhabit your headspace in quite a miraculous way. Incidentally, headspace and your mind and clear your mind and so on is very much what the Scottish government's into. If you look at the Scottish government's YouTube site, every second program or clip that they upload this winter has been about, you're mentally ill, aren't you? Well, let the Scottish government tell you how to become less mentally ill. It's quite a shocker.
Yeah, I like the one I read at the beginning.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it's spread now. There was even a Scots poetry channel that didn't upload this evening that I caught a sight of, and it was a young poetess saying that 2020 been a horrible year, and what was her punchline? I'll spend the rest of the year sorting out my heat. This has become absolutely normative among the 20-somethings. This is my mental frailty. What's yours?
We're going to be off at a tangent here, but I've been thinking recently in people I talk to quite a few people on the telephone, meet people here and there, out for a walk, etc. And the general feeling, how things are going, oh, yeah, fine. You might lockdown might come up in the conversation or whatever. But generally, people are, perfectly happy and jolly and getting on with things. But then you hear other people, if you look at things from the government or what you've seen in the media, the assumption is that just everyone's falling to bits. And you've just got to sort of start every conversation, every presentation on the assumption that that's what's happening. And so I find it quite strange sometimes. Our family, we're just getting on with things. No, it's not normal, but everyone's perfectly happy. It's all fine. But then I see something on the media or something coming on YouTube or whatever. Someone say, "Oh, are you sure everyone's okay? Oh, it's really tough, isn't it?" I said, "No, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Everyone's fine. You're just planting the idea in people's minds." But it's just the therapeutic culture, which dominates Scottish education, dominates the government. I mean, would anyone in the Scottish Parliament even be aware that such a thing exists? I would suggest not. It's just not.
No. Well, this is the big vector. I suspect it's going to be the big 2021 theme for UK Column News. Things are coming together in this regard, and we're calling it psychological attack. We already have Dr. Bruce Scott from Jedburgh has put an article up called The Psychological Attack on the UK from his professional specialism. And then we've started a podcast series, which is also on the front page at the moment by Brian and me, called The Psychological Attack, going more to the Soviet dissident and defector warnings. And tomorrow, God willing, we'll have another very long transcript of two Irishmen talking about this psychological attack, and just the things you highlighted there. You're not all right, really, are you? There's the suggestive use of language to get inside people's head that has been completely minutely dissected by this NLP and hypnotherapy specialist John Anthony in the transcript that's going up within the next 24 hours, we hope. So if people want a single theme to latch onto, it is, I am being psychologically attacked. I'm being taught learned helplessness. I'm being addicted to my codependence.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about that, particularly in education. So we'll look at that with interest. Let's move on to our last topic. I think we've got a quarter of an hour. Satanic ritual abuse. Now, quite a few of you might be thinking, "Oh no, what on earth is that?" Others of you might be thinking, "Yeah, I've seen something about that. What's been going on?" Now, a key figure in terms of raising aware of this alleged satanic ritual abuse, we won't take it for granted. We'll see where we head with this. There's been a chap called Wilfred Wong, who's been doing things on social media, campaigning on this, and claiming that satanic ritual abuse is quite widespread in Britain and around the world, but there are various reasons why we don't hear as much about it as we should do. But do you want to fill us in a bit about Wilfred and his adventure?
Yeah, the long and the short of it is that Wilfred Wong has been arrested, and if you will believe the statement of the police forces that combined to arrest him, North Wales and Thames Valley and others, they are claiming that he was abducting a child at knife point. That's at least the version that found its way into the papers for shock effect. Scratch a bit, and it turns out that at knife point translates to what the police actually said was the male, that's what they usually call them these days, the male had a bladed device on him. In other words, a penknife. He had a penknife in his pocket when he was arrested. With a very short time span, I can only give broad brush strokes, and I'm going to have the policy of not naming names of any alleged perpetrators, because a lot of this casework is not even directly mine. It will be more David Scott's original findings or Wilfred Wong's. But I obviously carefully review everything that I see, and we have confidences to maintain as well when people associated with these cases come to us. Wilfred Wong is who he is because he has the boldest and most persistent of a number of people, mostly committed Christians, who have, since the Satanic Panic, as it was called in the United States and the United Kingdom in the late 80s, become quite convinced that it is a routine thing for groups of people to abuse children, and I have to add always animals and vulnerable adults as well, not just for reasons of sadism, paedophilia, necrophilia, and the usual bunch of horrors which are part of human fallen nature, but more particularly they wish to do so as worship of Satan, which is why it's called satanic ritual abuse. It's a subcategory of ritual abuse, which itself is a subcategory of abuse. It was completely unthinkable for the longest time that even abuse of children or animals took place. It was hushed up until living memory. So there's no logical barrier to the proposition that there is also ritual abuse and satanic ritual abuse as smaller subsets of that. Wilfred Wong was always in the flurry of interviews he did in 2020 during the lockdown before he got arrested, attempting to rescue a child, it would seem. What happened, what Wilfred was always stressing during those interviews was that they didn't have to take his word for it. They could go to his website, the Campaign Against Satanic Ritual Abuse. I think the website is CASRA, CASRA.org, or maybe there's a .uk on the end there. And one of the things on there is just his own list of 10 successfully prosecuted cases in the highest evidentiary standard in the world, the law of England and Wales, which did have an acknowledged or avowed satanic element to them. Also the Metropolitan Police, as he would never tire of saying, and several US police forces, Idaho comes to mind, have trained officers who deal with the victims of satanic ritual abuse, and these police forces put on their websites in various parts of the English-speaking world there is such a thing as satanic ritual abuse. So the idea that it's all stuff, nonsense and fantasy, for example, that if we just stick to Scotland, the South Ronaldsay case of 1991, wasn't it, or the Holly Gregg case of around 2000, was all made up and must have been because these things don't happen. That's a very facile argument, I'm afraid, but particularly one that social conservatives with a small c are prone to making because it's outside their world of experience. Now, from the time when satanic ritual abuse started to become an area of focus, both sides of the Atlantic in the late 80s, there have been a number of books. Two that stand out here, you can get PDFs online from various places or get the books, is Chasing Satan by Diane Corr, a very thorough journalist who was in the East Yorkshire, Hull area, one of the epicenters of it in Britain, and found herself run out of the country in the end for her investigations. And another, by a Scots journalist, I think, Andrew Boyd, Blasphemous Rumours, Is Satanic Ritual Abuse Fact or Fantasy, an Investigation? And he goes, let me just read this. The problem of proof is a whole chapter. Where are the bodies? Where's the evidence? He goes into this. He goes into this is a very important bit, multiple personality disorder, otherwise known as dissociative identity disorder. For many people, including Wilfred Wong, the clincher that this really goes on in every county and every town in the land is across the Western world, by the way, is this realization that if you go to any psychiatrists who treat, or psychotherapists, I think I should say more particularly, who treat the victims or the sufferers of dissociative identity disorder, alias multiple personality disorder, and you ask them frankly, how many of your patients are here because of satanic ritual abuse? Even if you get an embarrassed silence or a close down of the conversation, you've seen enough to realize at that moment that they know jolly well that it's happening and that the people involved are often very elite. The biggest case in Scotland, which I mentioned a moment ago, is Holly Gregg, HOLLIEGREIG, which does have satanic elements to it, as well as being allegedly involving very high up people in Aberdeenshire. But just to show you here, without going into the details, that is the file left by the late Robert Green of evidence and correspondence on the Holly Gregg case, which I am now writing up. So that is the kind of detail people are dealing with. So even on the, I think particularly on the conservative and Christian end of the spectrum, if people are minded to say this is all dangerous nonsense and you should stop talking about it, you are actually accusing men like Wilfred Wong and Robert Green, who have been prepared to go to prison for these, for standing up for these victims, of bearing false witness. And you're doing so in the light of a very thorough, multi-jurisdictional, multi-decade lot of evidence. Now, I know that there's trolls and there's also well-meaning acerbic people on YouTube and elsewhere who like picking holes in what the victims of SRA have said and unfortunate things that they've done in outbursts or injudicious moves they've made. Some of them may be trying to, crusade for the truth. It's very difficult to judge the motives in these areas. But the overall lines of what's being claimed, I don't think is feasible to counteract now.
Yeah, now there's something I've looked into, read a bit about. One of the books that you talked about there a long time ago. Looked at some of the things recently as well. I think generally, human nature being what it is, these things are going to go on. So I don't doubt that there have been cases where it's happened, and there's very solid evidence for those cases. What that extrapolates to, I think, is the question. But just to say, with Wilfred Wong, we are assuming that this case where he's been is now awaiting trial for trying to kidnap this boy. It seems like he was trying to rescue him, and he had his mother with him, etc. I think doing that, I would suggest. I don't think many people would say that was a wise thing to do, to get a team of people together to go and try and do that, unless the danger was absolutely imminent. But if the danger was absolutely imminent, would the authorities not have been willing to do something? So we don't know the full story there, but it seems like.
Well, there are charities, and there's two, in fact, in Scotland that more or less specialise in dealing with the victims of satanic ritual abuse. By the way, another place to look for hard evidence is at the fertility clinics, about particularly the female adult victims they treat, because as a result of the horrendous abuse these victims have from their earliest years. They're very badly damaged internally and reproductively. But then these two charities that, from that wing and or that approach and others, help the victims, have made no secret of it in recent years. One of them, the figures there, Laurie Matthew, has written several books about this, Scotland-specific books, that at some point they've decided that they had to advise, particularly the mothers, where they were in danger of having the children giving to abusive fathers, the thing that happened in Samantha Baldwin's case that you can view on David Scott's channel Northern Exposure. In that case, at that level, they've started saying to the mothers, get out of Scotland, get out of the UK, get out of Europe if you can, or more particularly, if you have to stay, then don't talk to the police. Just lie low. We have an underground railroad situation. So that has been, repetitively the situation, particularly where the non-abusive parent has woken up to what's happening. It's often the mother waking up to the fact that daddy and his chums do unspeakable things, and often in a satanic context, to the children and share the children around. If you realize that most police forces in Britain, and I choose my words carefully, but we've got enough casework now to say this, most will allow the matter to be given to a corrupt mid-ranking officer who will barge the well-meaning constable off the job and will close the case. We've seen that time and again.
So I would take some convincing about that. I think generally like child protection culture in Britain now is so all pervasive. I would take some very direct.
I understand this, and there are people who hop off this bus at several stages, such as the one you're at, and say, I find it hard to believe that it's the norm. We're dealing with pinch points here. That the specialist people, it's as with the police treatment of rape victims, which has undergone a cultural metamorphosis since about the 90s. That's a good example of pinch points, that the officers are told you must refer these kinds of victims to these specialists who can help. But the flip side of that is when you get allegations of SRA, that is, even in counties away from metropolitan areas, but particularly where the power and money concentrates, London and Edinburgh, it's very quickly within the police. This is, we're going to have people breathing down our neck. That again, the amount of fear that you see there, you would need to talk probably anonymously to serving police officers in various parts of the UK to ask about this. But certainly Edinburgh, where the power and the money is, if you were to ask what happens with allegations of satanic ritual abuse coming from children and young adults in Edinburgh, look at the relevant branch of Police Scotland, and you will find that those prepared to talk to you about it off the record will say, well, that there's a couple of people hovering around, and they always make sure that the story gets buried.
So I would think anyone in that situation would be so confident to be a whistleblower because the whole culture is going to be right behind you. And just moving on to them, we're going to Wilfred Wong. And as I say, I'm not going to argue that this.
But before we get off the strand of whistleblower, right? And I'm not defending everything that he's done, and I'm not even going to name him. People know who I'm talking about. But one Metropolitan Police detective who has come out, I know he's taken a lot of flack for what he said. I'll suspend judgment on that. But he has given a credible, detailed, repeated account of going right to the top to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner herself, Cressida Dick, and saying, why are you not taking seriously what I'm telling you about very high up people? And just the same in Edinburgh, by the way. We know the names of the sheriff, that's the judge in Scotland, who wrote a report to the Scottish government in the dedicated inquiry for that purpose, naming the extremely high officers of the law, high judges who were involved in pimping children from Edinburgh children's homes for satanic and non-satanic ritual abuse. We know that this goes on. John Wedger confronted Cressida Dick, so the highest police officer in the land in many ways with this, and he said that he's given a detailed account of her just sitting there stony faced and not interested, but as soon as he said a slightly naughty racial word to just by way of a comparison to say, well, if I was calling one of your fellow officers a whatnot racial slur, then they sat bolt upright and said, you can't possibly say that, how dare you, how disgusting. That's the morality we're dealing with whether we're talking Police Scotland, Metropolitan Police, or any other force.
Especially with that issue and the balances between the testimony of one person who might seem entirely credible against a very large organization, again, with the potential for a huge number of whistleblowers. If that's going on at any scale, then there would be an army of people surely coming forward. It's like all these things. It's very difficult to judge, isn't it? It's at the end of the day, it comes to some extent. It comes down to a disposition.
It does. It absolutely.
Go on.
There are people who are well disposed to believe the claims, but as I mentioned a moment ago, find one or other aspect of it too hard to swallow. Well, thank God that they're still so innocent, I would say, and I'm not going to to push them. And particularly, there's a lot of people in the medical profession, in the widest sense, don't always believe this and would be quick to point to paranoia or the power of auto-suggestion or whatnot. And there's a group of pagan or distinctly non-Christian survivors of SRA who make claims that it's an evangelical club or cult that's got hold of this situation and is just milking it and is seeing devils under the bed, as it were. So that there is a lot of incredulity that, or stretched credulity, that we have to deal with here. It's by slow degrees, I think, that all of us involved in UK Column have realised the full extent of this horror. And it's not the case that nobody is trying to blow the whistle. It's the case that there's so many barriers to blowing the whistle and then getting away with it. And just in closing on that thought, one aspect that I keep coming back to is geographical focus. Where you get within a geographical focus, and I do have to name the northeast of Scotland here, particularly Buchan, but also up towards Caithness, it comes back again and again and again and again and again with the same officers in the same public service departments, police, social work and whatnot, and the councils being named by disparate victims who don't know each other. And you can say that more broadly when you're talking about the technique aspect of SRA, the unthinkable things that are done to children. I being a multilingual person, I have the privilege of reading accounts and hearing accounts by speakers of different languages who don't even have the same religion or alphabet as each other, let alone the same language or whatever, same country, who are giving completely similar accounts of bizarre and unexpected things.
Well, the way forward is to publish and to present to relevant authorities. And as I say, I'm more than happy to believe that human nature is capable of all sorts of things. As I say, I'm sure it has been in the past and is to some extent at the moment. So I'm open to be persuaded by the evidence. Just one last thing with Wilfred Wong. I was looking at, someone sent me a document that he'd put out to his supporters. And he put this, I mean, this to me really undermined his credibility in my eyes. He put, it could well be that the Satanists engineered the pandemic in the first place. Now that to me, I was reading away thinking, you know, I'm not quite sure you've got evidence to back up what you're saying. I'm sure there's something in it. But when I come to that, I think, whoa, my confidence in your judgment is just...
I get it. I understand what you're saying there. This is him, as it were, being a stenographer and compressing a point that he was making through a whole glut of 2020 interviews, which is that he had spoken to people in and close to the intelligence agencies who said that there is a club of Satanists within our ranks, as there is in any other power agency like the police and the army, who have their own agenda, which is finding the most lethal pathogens they can. And let me just say, as a former GCHQ officer with a CBRN specialism who made trips to Portendown and spoke to their people in other venues as well, I will not discount that. I got the shivers about some of the people around Portendown, and every Western country seems to have an equivalent biological warfare agency where, you know, routinely inexplicable things happen. And a few characters, again, much like the SRA protectors and whistleblower bashers within the police or social work, a few of the keynotes are occupied by these people who seem to, you know, be regarded by the rest as the unmentionable ones, you know, the shadows looming over the rest of the staff. So it is something I'm not prepared to discount.
Right. I would say again with that's something where I would need an awful lot of evidence to move me in that sort of direction. I think that's the thing with the theory about a hidden organization. Obviously, the fact that it's hidden means the fact that you don't see much of it fits in with the idea of believing that the thing exists. Because if it did exist, you wouldn't see much of it because it would be hidden. Which is why you get the huge spectrum of views on these sort of issues. Because, you know, if you believe in something hidden, then...
Well, exactly. Just take, you know, the Soviet and other Eastern Bloc defectors that Brian Gerish and I are talking about in a very recent upload on the UK Column channel, Psychological Attack on the UK, and the article is ukcolumn.org, front page at the moment. Psychological Attack on the UK, start of a series is the one to look for. And if you look at the embedded video at the bottom of that, I go into some detail on this, that all the Soviet defectors were in agreement there was a horrendous plan. It's just that they had seen different parts of it. You know, and how much devil they saw in the mix and how much human wickedness was the variable. Very, very comparable to what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a fascinating discussion. I think all three areas we've been over, I think you've had a lot of really interesting things to say, a lot of knowledge to share with us. So really appreciate you coming on. So
It's been a great pleasure.
Till next time, I'm sure we can find lots of other things to talk about on another occasion. So thanks very much for watching, those of you watching live, and those of you who are going to be watching later as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. And again, thanks to Alex, and good night.